Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Japanese Politics 101 room. Every Sunday, Timothy Langley, who runs a company in Tokyo that focuses exclusively on Japanese politics, government and public affairs, and host Pai Matsuoka, bring to you the latest developments in Japanese politics. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, Maya, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is, today is January 9th, so this is our second briefing of the year. We had a briefing on January 2nd, and I hope to be able to wrap up within 30 minutes, and then we can go into questions. So if you feel so inclined, please go ahead and ask Maya to come up on the stage. A good place to start is where we left off the last time we had a briefing. If you might recall, I'm just going to hit the topics that we discussed, so it refreshes your recollection and reminds you of how much can happen even over a period where the Diet is not in session, where people are kind of on vacation and things are supposed to be somewhat slowed down. So the last time we talked, we discussed about the officials from Japan that will represent the country going to the Beijing Olympics. We talked about the incredible, it wasn't quite incredible at that point, only a week ago, the Omicron incursion into Japan and what it's doing throughout the rest of the world. We talked about a defense meeting, which would include defense and foreign ministers, which would be upcoming this week. I will talk about that. We talked about Russia complaining to the United States and Japan about, them kind of ganging up, even though they sailed through the straits in a flotilla of Chinese and Russian naval vessels. The Ministry of Defense suffered from a hack about a year ago, and finally it was reported how severe that hack was almost 11 months later. We talked just a little bit about that. We talked a little bit again about the meaning of Mr. Kishida's new capitalism, which is beginning to be fleshed out. And even over the vacation, more kind of news about that has come out. We talked about the status of forces with the United States and Japan and how that impacts Okinawa and the kind of irritation that is felt by the governor there, Denny Tamaki. We talked about the budget increase for defense spending, most of that actually centered on what's going on in Japan. We talked about the appointment of the new ambassador for Japan, Rahm Emanuel, and we don't have news updating us on when he will be moving, him and his family, to Tokyo. But it is a big piece of news to come out of Washington. We finally do have an ambassador after 2.5 years. And we talked a little bit about this gerrymandering that needs to go on in Yamaguchi, where the former Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, the current Foreign Minister, Mr. Hayashi, the current Minister of Defense, Mr. Kishi, all have their Diet seats. And the gerrymandering requires that one of those seats needs to be given up because of the shift in population and the impact that has on internal LDP politics. So I hope you joined us, last week so that you know of that. And if any of these things are of keener interest to you, let's talk about them. But let me talk about what's happened since then. What have kind of been the important things that have happened in Japanese politics since the last time we got together, building on what we did last week. And if you need a little bit of a refresher, let's talk about it. Just ask Maya to come up with. So today I'd like to talk about Omicron virus and what it's doing to Japan and the quasi state of emergency. I'd like to talk a little bit about defense, following up on our last meeting. I'd like to talk about the Constitutional Democratic Party. It is beginning to make plans. You can see from what they're doing, what their projection is for the upper house election, which will be in about 6 months. South Korea is going through a presidential election right now, and that has impacts on us. There's a little bit more news. We were talking about Mr. Kishida's new capitalism. There's more kind of things coming out as time allows people to analyze it on Japan's economic security strategy, which really it's kind of like the digital agency. It permeates a lot of other ministries. It's not just a pure silo. So it's a pretty big deal, and how he decides to roll that out will have implications for the economy, for a lot of different things. And so I'd like to just touch on that. North Korea fired a hypersonic missile on Thursday. We'll talk about that. The Australia-Japan Defense Pact, that was pretty much in the news on maybe Saturday because it was signed on Friday. And for people who are just kind of looking sideways at television or just glancing at the newspaper, you will have noticed that it was a pretty big deal on the news Friday night and on Saturday. I don't know what the implications, how huge the implications are, but I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And finally, Mr. Kishida showed up at the New Year party for Rengo, which is the Japan Trade Union Confederation, very powerful in terms of representing employees and the workers' rights and their wages. And in line with his finger quote, new capitalism, wages are a big component of that. This is a pretty big deal. So those are the things that I'm going to focus on today, and hopefully I can get through those pretty quickly, and then we can open up the floor. So first of all, Okinawa, Hiroshima, and Yamaguchi prefectures have gone into quasi-state of emergency. This is a status that is required from the central government to allow governors to exercise a little bit more forcefully on businesses operating within their prefectures. They need central government authority to, for example, restrict movement, to close down businesses, to force people to do certain things. So, in fact, this request comes from the governors, and it is because Okinawa, Hiroshima, and Yamaguchi are suffering from an astounding increase in the virus, the Omicron variant. So in Japan, in just in 1 week, the number of infections has increased 9-fold throughout Japan. In Tokyo, a 12-fold increase, and overall, I mean, when you compare it to what's going on in other countries like the United States, it's like, what's the big deal? But for the Japanese, it is somewhat untenable. 4,400 new cases just right now. That's where we stand right now, and like I said, that's a 9-fold increase in just 1 week. Tokyo has 922. It might have increased a little bit in the news today. I didn't check, but that's a 12-fold increase in just 1 week. So the governors are becoming very concerned about that, and so they've asked for the ability to restrict businesses. So it turns out that Okinawa is particularly hard hit. So the governor has asked closure of business, restaurants to stop serving alcohol, and to close their doors at like 8 o'clock at night. So that really puts a damper on things. Hiroshima and Yamaguchi are less severely affected, and the governors are acting accordingly there, not as tight as Okinawa. And the other thing that's interesting about Okinawa is, well, in fact, of all the 3 prefectures, they host American military bases. And I think people who are on this call know that the United States has for many, many months not required military personnel who are coming into Japan from the United States or from elsewhere in the world to be tested for COVID before they get on the airplane to come into Japan. So that has resulted in a couple of flare-ups, most notably in Okinawa just recently. And soldiers coming into Okinawa bring the variant with them, and it has caused clusters. And so the governor of Okinawa is really upset about that. I mean, it's just one of the other things that he's upset about, not only the central government heavy handling of the movement of the Marine base from Futenma to Heneko, but also the central government not liking him as the governor of Okinawa. The governor's race is going to be this summer. Mr. Governor Tamaki goes up for re-election, and the Liberal Democratic Party is not too favorable of him. So in the last budget, they've reduced the amount of money that they're allocating for economic development for Okinawa. It's kind of a slap at the face, and they will be supporting a contender for his position. So he's mad at a lot of things. There's always this tension between Okinawa and the central government. But this one is pretty serious that the U.S. troops have been coming in. So he has demanded, and also Mr. Kishi, the defense minister, has also made this a point of contention between the United States and Japan. The United States is, tightening up and requiring. So if you're a foreigner coming into Japan, number one, Japan doesn't allow just foreigners who have just business interests or something to come to Japan. And if you are a resident here, if you live here, if you're working in a company and you had to go home and you're coming back, they do allow you in if you test for COVID 72 hours beforehand, and then 24 hours, and then you get on the plane, and then they put you into a hotel and you stay there for 3 days, and then you can home quarantine. That's pretty severe. The American military forces don't follow that, or haven't followed that. So they're being forced now to tighten up on that. Governor Tamaki has requested for a kind of curfew, actually stricter than a curfew is just keep your soldiers on base and don't have them going off base. A request for the U.S. military. It will probably receive a little bit of an acknowledgement there, because the situation is so severe, and because the distinction between what the United States military has done for their service personnel coming into Japan and what the Japanese do with the Japanese nationals and what they do on a national basis is so different that the United States will have to toe that line for no other reason but just to kind of keep things a little bit calm. The Defense Ministry and the United States has signed that budget. There was a 10% increase in the 10-year budget. We talked about that, I believe it was last week. And this march forward on trying to develop Japan's offensive capabilities, not just the defensive capabilities, is a component of that. So I don't want to go on too long about it. The defense meeting between the defense minister and the foreign ministers of the United States and Japan did happen this week. It happened on Friday. It was a big how-to-do that was played up last year. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it was not done in person. It was planned to be in person, but it was virtual. And so Foreign Minister Hayashi, Defense Minister Kishi met with Defense Minister Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Austin Blinken on a call that was, they talked about all of the things that you would think that they talk about, but it is basically not a total blackout. Press is reporting on the extent of their conversations. They did have private conversations as well, but it's a virtual meeting rather than face to face. So that somewhat impacts the scope and the content of what the discussions are. Importantly, though, the ambassador, Mr. Ron Emanuel, who has been appointed, so we can call him ambassador now, attended that meeting as well. That's pretty interesting. And you might not know, but there is an individual, Raymond Green, who is the charge now. He is the highest individual in the U.S. Embassy. He's not ambassador rank, but he is number 2, and he will be charge, which is ambassador without portfolio until the ambassador comes. So it's a very powerful position, and he's well known in the region, a very astute politician and diplomat, actually. So he signed an agreement that day after this meeting with Mr. Kishida for the funding of military forces here in Japan. It's, as we reported earlier, $9 billion US over a 10-year period. So that's pretty significant. So we are on a roll there. This was held in hiatus because of COVID for a year, so the agreement had actually lapsed. But the budget and the Diet voted on that. They passed the budget in the last session, and so now we are moving forward on that. More on political grounds, the Constitutional Democratic Party is, as you know, the largest opposition party. You've got the LDP in a coalition with Komeito. They are the party in power. And then the opposition party is led by the Constitutional Democratic Party. You will remember that they went from maybe 111 seats to like 93 seats in the last election. And so they had a whole change in the leadership. The Diet is now out of session, so they're they've got new leadership now. Kenta Izumi is their head. And what they did this last week, since the Diet is out of session and people have a little bit of flexibility in terms of travel, is almost en masse, they went to Issei Shrine. This is important. It's not a Yasukuni Shrine, thankfully. They didn't visit Yasukuni, but basically Issei Shrine is the grand shrine for the Shinto religion here in Japan. And visiting that is a big deal. It's a special deal. And they went there to pray for prosperity and for their fortunes, particularly going up to the upper house election, which will be in about 6 months. And chief among the things that they need to decide upon is when they did so miserably this last election, some attribute it to their cozying up to the Japan Communist Party and defining whose seats will run, and we will relinquish putting a candidate in a seat where the Communist Party is running, and you relinquish your candidate in the seat where we're running, so that we can kind of somehow end up in a better position than we were, because we all have a common enemy, that's the LDP. That didn't work for them. And so they need to figure out, are we going to still do that? The Constitutional Democratic Party, obviously, since they visited Ise Shrine, they believe in the emperor. They are proponents of the U.S.-Japan Security Pact, and they are defenders of the Japan's self-defense forces. The Communist Party, on the other hand, is against the emperor system. It is against the U.S.-Japan Security Pact. It is against any revision to the Constitution that might impact the definition of what the self-defense forces is. So the seats that are coming up, the Diet is not in session. It is not a hot topic right now, but it will become increasingly hot as we move into February and March on the election of the upper house. As you might know, there are 248 seats in the upper house. The coalition between the LDP and Komeito hold 136 of those seats. That's a pretty big margin. The LDP alone holds 108, and the Komeito holds the remaining 28. And the fight here is to increase that substantially, but they don't need to do too much because they already have a solid majority there. For the Constitutional Democratic Party, they have 48 seats. So 48 seats compared to the LDP's 108 seats. They've got a lot of work to do there. So how they go about that is something that is occupying Mr. Izumi's thoughts, and probably the reason why he wanted to visit the Ise Shrine. So it's an interesting thing. When you talk about Japanese politics, the Constitutional Democratic Party is an important component of that, but really the big kahuna is the LDP. So we spend most of our time talking about LDP factional politics, for example, the gerrymandering in Yamaguchi Prefecture. We've already talked about that. There hasn't been any dramatic movement in that conversation over the last week, so I'm not going to go into that anymore. I'd like to shift to the Beijing Olympics. Did you know that, in the Tokyo Olympics, they didn't allow for Japanese to attend the Olympics, and they obviously didn't allow for foreign spectators too. It was a really big hit to the Tokyo metropolitan government, who is saddled with most of the expenses, but also the national government and also worldwide, to have those television rights and also the marketing rights, and just for the Olympics to have so few spectators is just really too bad. In the Beijing Olympics, they will allow for national. Currently, a couple of cities now are actually in strict lockdown. If you're watching the news, some Chinese cities are in strict lockdown. You look at the videos in the main intersections, there's nobody on the streets. So currently, the Beijing Olympics will allow for national spectators, but there will be no foreign spectators allowed. And also, as we've also discussed here, there is no diplomatic representation coming from Japan, the United States, several other countries. France is withholding that, and also South Korea is withholding that because for a lot of different reasons. But it's not a universal snub at the Chinese. But in any event, the Chinese have a real problem, maybe on the scale of the Japanese, we won't know. It's 30 days before the Olympics start, so it's really approaching us very quickly. The main point about talking about the Beijing Olympics is that there are companies now in Japan who do sales and marketing about sports goods and drinks and all sorts of things. Some of them who are sponsors, paid sponsors. When you, for example, Coca-Cola, when you sponsor the Olympics, it's usually a 5 Olympic deal. So you usually bid for and then get a sponsorship for a multiple Olympics. It's not just a one-off. So many of these marketeers that are Japanese are reluctant to begin promoting the Olympics and selling their products, and this puts them in a difficult position. Their shareholders want them to sell more product and to utilize the Olympics as a mechanism to do that, but there are a lot of people who are reluctant to do that because of the situation with the Uyghurs, the discriminated national people in China who are getting a really bad deal, and that is underlying a lot of the diplomatic response to not sending representatives. There are a lot of things to complain about Japan, but the reason why people aren't sending diplomatic representatives is not because of what China is doing to Taiwan or the incursions or the flights or the aggressiveness. It's all based on human rights, and that's what is the kind of unifying factor there. So for people who are making products, they are very, very sensitive to being painted with, you're supporting, the Chinese policy of discriminating internally and the bad things that they're doing. So they're really in a difficult situation. It remains to be seen how that will happen. Beijing it's only 1 hour away. So when the Olympics do occur, according to television time, it really suits the Japanese public for watching the Olympics. But the sales and marketing that occurs on television and in stores is really left open to question. So keep your eye on how that develops. South Korea, as you know, is going through an election of their presidents. The conservatives and the left-leaning Democratic Party they have their own contenders. The election is in March, just right around the corner, March 9th. It looks like it's going to be contentious because it is something like the Democrats and the Republicans fighting against one another. And whoever wins will determine what politics and policies will be pursued going forward, particularly with regard to potential appeasement for North Korea, how we're going to fix the trade issues between China and South Korea, what the relationship between the United States and South Korea will be, and not only that, but this relationship between Japan and South Korea. The United States pins high hopes on repairing that relationship, so it's difficult. It's difficult at best, but depending on who wins this election will determine a lot of that. South Korea-Japan relations could get further worse. They could get better. So a lot of people are watching that. We should be watching that too, because it portends a lot for what's going to be happening in the near future. Shifting gears now, we talk a lot about Japan economic security and what the strategy is of the Kishida administration. He's made this a key to Japan's national security, having a firm handle on the economic security. So he's put together a draft for a ministry, and in fact named a new minister for this ministry. And the challenge for the Japanese government is to craft a strategy that advances the nation's security and just isn't like a fig leaf for protectionism and mercantilism and expansion of bureaucratic power, which is what we kind of knee-jerk reaction to. So a lot of times, Japan has had its own history with protectionism and using the Ministry of International Trade and Industry formally as its protective mechanism and allowing the Japanese economy to take off. It created a lot of problems, and there is some fear that this is probably this could possibly be like that. But the government is thinking about economic securities shaped by this committee that is headed by Mr. Kishida, even before he became a prime minister. And this study group is called the Strategic Headquarters on the Creation of a New International Order. And he's been the head of that. He's still the head of it. And it's now gone into more of a formal structure. And it is now designed to produce a strategy, a Japan national strategy. So this economic strategy for security rests on two main pillars, which are strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability. So the first requires that Japan have the means to ensure economic well-being of its citizens and its national security and economic capacity. And what this kind of is reflective of is Japan's fears of vulnerability by dependence on other countries for key economic inputs. So they've found that China has withheld like rare metals and that sort of thing, the supply chain. So they're trying to distance themselves from that so that they are less dependent on foreign inputs. And the second pillar is that Japan has industrial capacity in fields considered important to the international society. So that's why you're seeing they have earmarked a lot of money for drawing chip facilities, semiconductor manufacturers to come to Japan. They put a lot of money into that for encouraging, for example, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to construct a huge semiconductor plant in Kumamoto. I think that that's pretty much a decided issue. A lot of it will be paid for by the Japanese government. So they're putting a lot of effort on that to strengthen Japan's self-dependence rather than reliance on inputs or production, particularly from China, but also from the United States as well. So you're going to see a lot more energy and outcome of that. You'll probably see a lot more of the semiconductor and high tech being developed in Japan. Somewhat related to this, the United States formed they have the Air Force, the Marines, the Army. They also have the a Space Force that they created, and the Japanese immediately jumped on that and formed their own Space Force. It's part of the SDF, but they are trying to weigh in on that because it's not just the potential battles that will happen on land or on the sea, but it's also the stuff that's going on in outer space that the Japanese are now beginning to focus a lot of energy and money on, and that is protection of satellites for navigation, for communications, that sort of thing. You'll remember that the Russians fired a missile at one of their satellites to test their capabilities. It did hit the target, and then it created a bunch of debris in outer space in low Earth orbit. That caused a lot of complaints from particularly the United States, but other people who have interest in outer space and satellites, that sort of thing. Nobody has been damaged as a consequence of that, and the pieces of the satellite will probably all fall harmlessly into the Earth. But what it highlights is that countries like Japan need to be in outer space too, and with the Japanese Constitution requiring that this must be only for defensive capabilities, not for offensive capabilities, it also applies to what they're doing in outer space. So they are developing capacities there that have been included in the new budget that was just passed. So there's a lot going on there. In reflection, other things are going on as well in terms of space and in terms of threats to Japan that it needs to consider, not just hacking and that sort of thing, which the Kishida administration came up with the economic security strategy, but also with regard to defensive and offensive capabilities, first strike, for example. So the news that the North Koreans have launched yet another hypersonic missile on Thursday made people, take great notice. This is their second hypersonic missile, which is different from your ballistic missile. It is launched from a missile and then it detaches in low Earth orbit and finds its target in real time. It can be actually steered for that. It's much more difficult to detect early and to defend against. So in light of this, the Japanese are really between a rock and a hard place. Are we forced to wait for somebody like North Korea, who is driven to be against our interests and developing all of these incredible capacities at a time when their country is actually going through a terrific hardship, to threaten our peace and prosperity with a missile that is designed to evade what capacities we have? So this drive to increase defense capabilities and enhance outer space and the ability without having offensive capabilities is a real conundrum for the Japanese. As a consequence of that, they need to rely on the U.S.-Japan Defense Pact, and they're beginning to broaden that out too. So you might remember that on Friday, Australia and Japan signed a defense pact. This is the first for Australia and Japan. It is somewhat of an outgrowth of the Quad. You might remember the Quad was Japan, the United States, India, and Australia to form a defense alliance in response to potential Chinese incursions or upsetting things in the region. Australia is concerned with this region as is Japan. It doesn't look like the Indians have really been ponying up to this to the degree that the Australians have. Japan and the United States obviously are bound at the hips. But this is a pretty big deal for Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Kishida. So they signed this. It is called the Reciprocal Access Agreement. So it indicates that access to defense forces or to abilities to share information or material or personnel. This is a pretty big deal. And the United States and Japan has their own defense security pact. It's been in place for maybe 40 years or so. But this is the first for Australia and Japan, and the reason why it became such a difficult issue to conclude is because Japan has a death penalty. You might remember the Minister of Justice signed off on a couple of 3 deaths last year, maybe 2 weeks ago. So 3 people were hung in Japanese jails, and this only happens every once in a while. But Australia is adamantly against capital punishment. And so this was the stumbling block between Australia and Japan to sign this, because under the agreement, they're stationing of forces, and it is potentially likely, possible, that an Australian national, a soldier assigned to Japan, could commit a crime which generates a capital punishment. And so they didn't want that. They wanted Japan to either give up the death penalty or to accommodate Australia in some certain way. So they had to go through that. Like in the United States, if a crime is committed by a U.S. soldier off base and it has certain attributes, then the Japanese police take over. But in most cases, it's the military police who take over, and Japanese law does not apply. It really upsets the Japanese, for example, when there is a robbery or a rape or a drunken driving accident in Okinawa, and the victims are somewhat taken care of by negotiations between the Japanese police and the U.S. forces to make payments or something. It never goes into the court system, and it feels like an occupation force in certain instances. So it does create a lot of controversy that's above and beyond the controversy in the first place of having foreign forces stationed there. But it's going to be somewhat similar with the Australians too. So this is a pretty big deal, and I think what this means is that the Australians and the Japanese will become more friendly. You'll see a lot more business in conjunction with this, and obviously, more defense cross training that happens there as well. So it's a pretty big deal, and that was signed on Friday. And finally, over the New Year's holidays, many companies maybe they went back to work on the 3rd or the 4th, which was Monday or Tuesday. But some of them didn't, and what they did was in anticipation of opening for business, they have a huge party and celebration. Let's go get them this year and that sort of thing. The Japan Trade Union Confederation, Rengo, held their meeting on Monday as well, and for the first time in 10 years, the Japanese Prime Minister showed up. So this is interesting because usually Rengo, the Workers' Federation, it's more a bastion for the opposition party, certainly for Komeito, the Clean Government Party, the coalition party of the LDP. The LDP stands more for big business, not for the workers, but for big business. And then there are several other political parties that really rely on the workers, the middle class, those kinds of voters. And so the fact that Mr. Kishida has decided to visit and to make a speech at this New Year's party for the Japan Federation of Trade Unions is a pretty big deal, and it indicates, his new capitalism, his insistence that there is a wage increase. He's insisted on 3%. Rengo has already promoted their 4% increase, so there is some wiggle room there. But the fact now that the Japan Federation of Workers has a champion in the Prime Minister's office is a pretty big deal. So it creates tension between the LDP and Keidanren, which is the organization of big businesses. There is a lot of horse trading that needs to be done between now and the upper house election, but this is all designed to put the LDP in a better stance than it is now, and also to diminish the opposition parties so that they don't have the Workers' Party or the trade unions to support them. what happens before the election is the wage increase offensive, Shunto, which happens in spring. And it's a pretty big deal for the workers to unite. There are demonstrations. There's a lot of news going on there with their negotiations between the workers and the parties. And I don't know if you know this, it's an interesting feature of Japanese industry that most of the trade unions, they have national trade unions, but most of the trade unions are company trade unions. So they have an organization where they combine their voices and they select what their policies are going to be. But the negotiations typically go on between the workers inside the company and the management of that company. That's how most trade negotiations are done here in Japan. So when they have a trade offensive in the spring, it is the workers of the company demanding. Maybe they'll have placards outside. Maybe they'll wear armbands. Maybe they'll have a work stoppage or something like that to demand their wage increases. And it usually happens over a period of 2 weeks. A decision is made, and then people get back to work. And then very shortly after that, we've got the upper house election. So this is something to look forward to. Mr. Kishida has stated publicly that he wants to see pay hikes. Keidan Ren has said pay hikes are not that necessary. And the economy and the Bank of Japan is working with keeping inflation low so that even if people don't get a pay increase, maybe they'll be encouraged somehow to spend money, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen either. So that's why Mr. Kishida has come up with this new theory on capitalism. So there's a lot to be to look forward to. There's a lot of action that we will see. The Diet will go back into session on the 17th. So by the time that we have our next meeting, they will already be launched, but I can't predict now what kind of topics we're going to be talking about this time next week, but I'm looking forward to it. That's about it for the hot topics that have hit my radar. And so I'd like to conclude here and open the room. And Maya, what have we got going?
Timothy, you talked about the Constitutional Democratic Party and how they lost by actually causing up to the Communist Party. They lost. So, which means that they'll have to reconsider their strategy for the upper house elections, and they obviously are doing that. But what prospects do they have? Which other parties can they actually get in a coalition with, so that they can benefit in the election campaign?
Okay, so the idea here is not that the Communist Party and the Constitutional Democratic Party will have a coalition or an alliance. That's not the idea, because their views are really very separate. It's more that the Communist Party has a very good election machine, and in every election district, they've got a candidate that they can run. Whether they win or not, the communists always push, for having a candidate there to have the voice of their party represented in any election district. The Constitutional Democratic Party is, it's not as well funded, it's not as well organized. So the idea is, we're going to scratch your back because we're not going to win in those areas that you're consecutively strong at, and it doesn't benefit us to run a candidate there. So we're not even going to run a candidate in that district there. And so you're somewhat guaranteed to have a victory there. And also it helps you save money in a campaign fight. But in exchange for that, we have a couple of districts that are very important to us that the communists are not going to win. They've never won, even though you've put a candidate there. And so what we'd like to do is economize by you kind of letting us have that seat because we've horse traded with you. That's what that's about. And the Communist Party has already said that even if in this last election we win really big, this strategy just really crushes the LDP, and we come out because mathematically and through this kind of analog of dealing with the election districts, we have come up stronger. We will never get into a coalition with the Constitutional Democratic Party. We would not accept that because our views on the emperor and on the Japan Security Pact, which are bastions of your policy, we don't agree with. So there's nothing that we could do there. But yeah, the Constitutional Democratic Party could form coalitions in an attempt to unseat the LDP. Politics is like that. Politics, strange bedfellows, as they always say. So it's hard to say right now. Mostly, that division, that strategy on getting election seats is only with the Constitutional Democratic Party and the Communist Party. And I think that there's still plenty of time to be seen there. I think the Constitutional Democratic Party sees there's great value there. It just wasn't tweaked the right way this last time. So they might try it again in a different kind of scenario. But if they get it wrong again, it really means the end of the current leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Mr. Izumi. But it also could mean that they fall from their currently held 44 seats to far fewer, and that would really it would enhance the LDP Komeito coalition, but it would really diminish the opposition parties. That's never in a vacuum, because some of the other parties, the opposition parties, could increase their standing, and so there's a lot of possibility and hope there. So I hope that responds somewhat.
So, as you say, if the Constitutional Democratic Party loses more seats than it did in the past election, so it will definitely mean the rise of other parties like
That's right. People will lose. They will lose confidence in that party, and although they are a distinctly different party, there are other parties that are somewhat similar. Ishin, for example. So it is possible that they could lose voters and just cease to be a party of serious contention in Japanese politics.
Yes, it's fascinating to watch, because Izumi, the new head of the Constitutional Democratic Party, he has been in the party for about 20 years now, and he's still a new leader, but he seems to have come with a lot of fresh ideas about how to reorganize the party. So, in a sense, there is a lot to see there from now on. And I wonder, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this is the year of the tiger, and he was born in the year of the tiger. So there's a lot of things that are kind of, yes, he's really being promoted and propelled as the new leader. And as I think they should dynamically and for the atmospherics, he needs to be portrayed in that way, because they're trying to reconfigure the CDP so that it is a contender to the LDP. A big deal.
Yeah. And I just wondered also, you said that if they lose more seats in the lower house, and if they don't perform well in the upper house election, Izumi, he may be dethroned. He may be,
absolutely.
Yeah, which is also an interesting thing, because we had Noda, the previous leader of the party, who lost quite a few of elections, but he still stayed as head of the party. So I don't know the dynamics, how they will work out. And
well, I think it's really curious, because I think one of the reasons why he was dethroned was not just because of the large number of seats that were lost, but also because the understanding of the reason for why they lost the seats was because this policy of cozying up to the Communist Party was the reason. The voters didn't buy that. They didn't want, if you're a communist, you're not going to vote for somebody who is in a different party. You're just not even going to vote. And similarly with the Constitutional Democratic Party voters in a district where they've said, look, we're not going to run a candidate, but the Communist Party is going to run their candidate. So please, to the degree you can, endorse them or support them, or don't fight against them, so that their seat is won. It just caused too much consternation. And the reason why that's really funny is because they're still pursuing that, right? They've still decided that the reason why it didn't work was because it wasn't tweaked the right way. So if in fact they lose seats, and I think if they don't gain seats, I think Izumi will be toast.
I see. Well, thank you for that analysis. Hiroaki, I hope you can speak now. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. Thank you,
Good morning.
Timothy. Good morning. Happy New Year, I should say. I would like to change the topics a bit, not a bit. I wonder about the Kishida-Biden summit schedule. So,
Right.
do you know something about it? And it is highly
Yeah.
appreciated if you know that. But before, wait, please. Many media speculate about the reason why the schedule of the Kishida-Biden summit in the Washington, D.C. not yet decided. Because of Kishida's ambiguous stance on China, or another media talk about just US is super busy on dealing with Omicron spread. I'm not sure it is correct or not, but do you agree on these views, or if you have any other reason why the schedule of this summit is not yet decided?
Thank you very much. I think for Mr. Kishida, he dearly wants to be in a meeting with the President of the United States, whoever that person is. You know, it has little to do with it. It's Joe Biden, and it's difficult to meet with Mr. Biden or whatever the excuse is. As far as Mr. Kishida is concerned, it is important for him to be seen as close to and familiar with the President of the United States. That has been the case with every prime minister over the last 20 years. So he desperately wants that. But I think the fact that the coronavirus is really hitting Japan hard, he hasn't made any trips. He was supposed to go and sign the Australia-Japan Security Pact, which he didn't. They did that virtually as well. So I think it's with regard to all foreign visits, I think the Japanese prime minister is sitting tight because he's trying to establish a kind of a model for the Japanese. Gaman shite. Let's tighten up. And I think that's why. I don't. It could possibly because of the virus, and yeah, I kind of don't think that because he might go to the United States and carry the virus, and then the president gets it. I don't think that that's the case. But I also think that the ambiguity with Kishida is, yeah, there is a little bit of that because they just haven't quite figured it out yet. But I think Japan will toe the line with the United States because it's really the only game that they have.
You mentioned that the main reason is Japanese side. So Kishida cannot leave my country, Japan, because of the COVID matter. So I hope that at least online summit between Kishida Biden will be soon. That is my desire.
Well, they, it's not just the Japanese, but the Biden administration too. They've held a couple of summits and analyzed how the president has performed there and what impact that has had. And I think probably that they've decided that fewer summits like that, even over the telephone, the fewer is maybe the better, but they can't get away with it. They need to have some. They did meet with Mr. Putin, but he also had some words with other leaders, but not quite summits. So I think that they're somewhat hesitant about that. I think most of it, and you've heard this as a complaint against the American administration, is most of the work is being done at the ministerial level, at the ambassador level, at the cabinet level. But I think there's a lot going on in the United States and a lot going on with the president and the vice president that encourages them to be a little bit less aggressive in terms of putting the president out front on these issues.
Thanks. The last question, if I may.
Sure.
Thank you. So, because nobody talk about that aspect, I'm wondering about how much Crimea situation actually affect the Indo-Pacific. Do you have any point?
Are you talking about Crimea or are you talking about Kazakhstan?
Yeah. I think it's both are linked. Actually, it's up to you.
For people who are unfamiliar with what's going on in Kazakhstan, that's a huge issue. It's almost as if a revolution has been triggered. It happened basically on Wednesday and Thursday. It spilled out on Wednesday, and the Kazakh president reacted very harshly and shoot to kill, and police force really reacted to the demonstrators, and the demonstrators in reaction reacted very harshly, killed a lot of police, burned down the president's residence, and so it's in full bore revolution right now. It's still unfolding. The Kazakh administration has called in the Russians as a peacekeeping administration to come in and help us quell this. So it's really a tough situation. In the Crimea, you're talking more about is Russia going to invade or not? And I think that is a tipping point that would probably be initiated as a consequence of something else happening, for example, in this region, or elsewhere, the greatest fear is that the Russians and the Chinese are going to form some sort of an alliance against the United States, and the price for that would be, Russian support of Chinese incursion into Taiwan. The good news here, though, is that we've got the Olympics coming up, so we can breathe easy that nothing's going to happen for the next 2 months or so. But who knows what's going to happen after that?
Oh, thank you, Timothy. The last point is very important point for me, not for only for me, because Olympic is a peaceful event for of course, all people all over the world. So China should refrain from any kind of challenges in the situation, the volatile situation in the world, like Crimea or Kazakhstan, or of course in the Pacific Taiwan Strait. Thank you.
No,
Thank you
no,
for your point.
it's huge, and it's a huge issue. It's not really my bailiwick. Is Stephen still here? Stephen's still in the audience. So Dr. Nagy is in the audience. He has a room. I think it's this Monday. I think if you're interested in geopolitics, definitely you've got to sign up. It's unfortunately only twice a month, but it's a great show, a great program, and Steve brings a lot of analysis and intelligence to those kinds of issues.
Good morning. Happy New Year to everyone.
Happy New Year.
I hear from you, Timothy, and Maya and Hiroaki. So I think Timothy's point is correct, that the timing in terms of any kind of aggression or more assertive behavior towards Taiwan is really not in the cards for the next, probably, I would say at least a year, but honestly, I think in the next 10 years. And why I say for the next year, of course, is the Winter Olympics, and the fall is something called the 20th Party Congress. Mr. Xi wants to make sure that everything domestically is calm, stable, and that is his priorities in terms of being reelected or reappointed leader of China in the fall of 2020. With that, we also have the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the rumors that it's zero COVID in China, in fact, they have regular spikes in COVID. And it creates challenges in terms of the economy. The Chinese approach is to shut things down. And that creates huge problems in terms of economic stability. I'd like to just go back to the point about Hiroaki's question about Prime Minister Kishida's not canceled, but postponed visit to the United States. I really think the timing is not appropriate for Kishida. I know Timothy's mentioned this many times in his talks, but the upper house elections are his priority. He wants to consolidate his position in the summer. And that means dealing with the COVID, ensuring that the COVID pandemic is under control, the economy is moving, and that will be the priority. And he can send surrogates to Washington to deal with the U.S.-Japan alliance, which is very strong. They are on the same page about many issues. And as Timothy pointed out, I think that there's limited value of spending a lot of capital to go to Washington and really distract President Biden from dealing with the real challenges that he faces domestically. The best way Japan can secure its national interest is to ensure that Biden is successfully domestically. They want to see him be reelected. They want to see the House and Senate not turn into a majority for the Republicans. And they want to make sure that Mr. Trump is not reelected. And with that, it's thinking about what is your broader priorities. And if your broader priorities is to ensure that happens, and if you can support Biden by not distracting him from the domestic challenges he faces, then Japan is probably playing a good hand. So I think there's domestic politics in both countries that's driving this decision.
Thanks, Stephen. Great
Thank you,
points.
Stephen. Great points. Yes, and I got a question via the back channel. Actually, a couple of questions, and one of them is about Mr. Meeks. Well, the representative, he's the chairman of the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. So he plans to visit Taiwan in January next year. And what kind of pro-Taiwan remarks do you think Meeks may make during this visit? This is the first question. So, Stephen, if you don't mind answering it, please do. And then the second one is to Timothy. What new measures will be taken, or probably both of you, sorry, what new measures will be taken from both U.S. and Japan sides?
So thank you very much. That's a great question. I'm not sure where Mick stands in terms of his support for the former president of the United States, whether he's a tried and true Trump convert, or is he just a political opportunist? But my sense is that, moving towards what we call strategic clarity on Taiwan is not in the United States' interests. And what that means is basically saying that if China does something to Taiwan, that the United States will come and defend Taiwan. So my expectation is that Mr. Mix will probably visit Taiwan and say a lot of things about strengthening bilateral relations. but it will be within the context of the One China policy. I think the concrete that they'll talk about is technology supply chains, such as semiconductors. They'll stress peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. And I think that is also what Japan will continue to do, send the strongest message to both to Taiwan and Beijing, that they don't support independence and they don't support a forced reunification. What they support is peace and stability and the status quo across the Taiwan Straits. And I think that has been consistent, despite the sexiness of former prime ministers and former vice ministers saying Taiwan's a security issue for Japan. A more nuanced reading is that they really support the status quo. They want to make sure that the One China policy remains intact, so that Japan can from that economic relationship with Taiwan and Hong Kong. And you may be saying, "Oh, can't they separate?" Not really. China or Japan does about last year did about 210 billion US dollars in exports to broader China region. So that includes Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. That's about 32 to 34% of Japan's overall exports. China will continue to be a critical partner for Japan, and it's limited in terms of how much of an aggressive stance or pro-Taiwanese stance that it can take moving forward.
Thank you for that.
What was the second question?
And the second question is, what new measures will be taken from both the US and Japan sides?
Maya.
Oh, sorry. Okay, the second question is, what new measures will be taken from both the US and Japan sides?
And on that question, increased deterrence, strong diplomacy, sending clarity in terms of the messaging that it's the status quo that both countries want to maintain. And they'll continue to work within different multilateral frameworks to send that message both to Beijing and Taiwan. And really thinking about Japan changing Article 9 or boosting military spending to 2 or 3 or whatever percent, this is just not on the table. And I don't think that's going to change in any. It will really be about strengthening deterrence through initiatives such as the Reciprocal Access Agreement between the French and the UK, and the Germans likely are also negotiating similar reciprocal access agreement. It's this layering of strategic that are going to provide a deterrence capability for Japan and to really try to bolster that status quo across the Taiwan Straits.
Right. Thank you for that. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen's remark on the Taiwan's. Yeah, that kind of message should be delivered, by the US representative. That is good. I hope that some kind of, the idea of peaceful resolution of Taiwan Strait or measure to make the Taiwan Strait stable and peaceful should be handled with the message. That is good. I'm proposing arms control between US and China of course, revealing post-INF is very good, but also like a measure to reduce tension in the region. Also, a proposal of this kind of measure should be handled with the US representative on the visit of Taiwan. It would be nice. I think so. Just comment.
Yeah, just let me add to this. I think that, the short-term period, Hiroaki, in terms of thinking about the Taiwan contingency, is very different from the contingency, for example, with North Korea. And what I mean by that is that, depending on what figures you believe, really, the Chinese economy is in a period of slowdown. And what I mean by that, the demographic challenges are really becoming more difficult to deal with. We see challenges within the property market. We see really the service sector not evolving into what we call a high-value service sector like we see in Japan, which suggests that China will be trapped in it won't be able to escape the middle income trap challenge. And from Japan's point of view and other countries' points of view, what they need to do is build resilience into the region through deterrence and multilateral trading agreements and building strong party-to-party relations. And again, Timothy can speak to this about how we see the LDP building strong partnerships in the region. Building resilience into the system until really the Chinese economy starts to create the conditions where the leadership can't be adventurous abroad, and they're going to have to deal with the many, many, many structural challenges associated with the economy domestically. And I think that pertains to Taiwan. It pertains to a lot of issues. Is that Japan will continue to, be as proactive as possible try to support and create resilience in supply chains and in terms of Taiwan. And China will become more easy to deal with in the next 5 to 10 years as it's really distracted with domestic economic challenges. COVID-19 is accelerating that in terms of the local disruptions to the economy. And of course, its behavior really has shifted how countries view China. And they're all selectively diversifying away from a China-centered production network, which means that all those incentives, investments will further slow the Chinese economy, creating challenges in the long term.
Ted, good morning. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
good morning. Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Morning, Ted. Good morning. Good to hear all of you and be with you. I just wanted to address the Congressman Meek's Taiwan visit just briefly. Greg, it's a sign of a rarity in American politics today. There's very little that Democrats and Republicans agree on, but one of the few things they do agree on is the need to get tough on China. It's a great campaign slogan, regardless of your congressional district, and the need to support Taiwan. At the same time, President Biden does not want to unnecessarily inflame tensions with Beijing. So he's not going to send over, at least I don't think, his Secretary of State. That would be a bit reckless. That would be poking his finger in Beijing's eye unnecessarily. But by sending over Congressman Meeks, the head chairman of the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Relations Committee, it's a clear sign that the United States stands with Taiwan. We're going to do what we can to help you defend yourselves, and we're going to support you through political support, although we're not going to recognize your sovereignty in public, but we're going to give you this backing in terms of photo ops with the president, and we're going to become closer in terms of trade and other exchanges. Nothing official. We're not going to declare or comment upon Taiwan's sovereign status or that you're an independent country, but we're watching, and we're watching closely. And it follows trips to Taiwan by other high-ranking congressional delegations, both Democrat, which is important because the Democrats right now control both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, although not for long, probably, but also Republican delegations from Congress have been over there in recent months. We're probably going to see this continue as China continues its pressure campaign against Taiwan. So Gregory Meeks, he has this district in New York City. I mean, he doesn't seem to have much relevance to Taiwan, other than the fact, of course, he's chairman of the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Relations, and it's a clear sign. We back Taiwan. Please, Beijing, pay attention to that. Realize that. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Great analysis. Yeah.
And since you're here, I've got another question via the back channel, which reads, I wonder how the Biden administration sees our new premier and foreign minister. So this is Mr. Kishida and Mr. Hayashi. They are fluent in English, meaning they have global view. So the US side sees them as good counterparts who can share the same views. Is this what you think, or does your opinion differ? So who would like to answer? Ted, maybe you can help us with the answer of this question, because you are based in the United States now and you have a clear view of what is is happening with the administration there.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration looks at Kishida and Hayashi, I think, favorably. Mind you, I think they're going to support whomever is in office, even if the minority parties come to power at some point, like they did some years ago. They're going to work with whomever's in power. But certainly, I think they have strong feelings both towards Kishida and Hayashi. They know Hayashi's a Harvard graduate. You're right; he does speak English. He speaks it beautifully. I think they think it's probably pretty cool. He plays in a rock band. He's got all those important things. But also Kishida, of course, he's one of Japan's longest serving foreign ministers. The highest levels of U.S. government has a lot of experience in working with Kishida. He's a known entity. I think they're completely comfortable working with both gentlemen.
I would add that I think it's less about Kishida and Hayashi and more about continuity in terms of procurement of defense capability, of investing in the alliance. And we've seen that, at the 2+2 meetings just this past Friday, even though it was virtually, they committed to increased burden sharing. These are the concrete take-homes that I think the U.S. administration is looking for from the Japanese government. And as long as Japan continues to invest in the alliance, both directly and indirectly, and I say directly is agreeing to increase their burden of base sharing, etc. But also when we look at what happened on Thursday with the signing of the Reciprocal Access Agreement between Australians and the Japanese, this is also investing in the alliance indirectly. Is that Japan is building partnerships to take on a greater burden within the region with another stalwart partner of the United States, Australia. And I think that the kind of stability and sustainability of the bilateral relations that any administration in Washington would like, and that the fact that Kishida and Hayashi and Kishi, the defense minister, are all on the same page of the book suggests that the bilateral relations are strong, and that the U.S. likes the kinds of structural investments that the Japanese are making into the region.
Well, I would like to steer the conversation a little bit into the direction of domestic Japanese public affairs, public policies. If you don't mind me doing this, I would like to go back to the point of economic security, which Mr. Kishida is working on at the moment. Timothy, you mentioned that Mr. Kishida has put up a plan for a new ministry, the Ministry of Economic Security, and he even has has a candidate for the person who will be the top of the ministry. However, we know that in terms of ensuring economic security, we need to think about different points. So one of them, of course, is secure supply of materials, raw materials, secure outflow of goods, of course, and security in terms of labor, or let's say working hands. And we know that Japan still lacks or faces the challenge of shortage of talent. In fact, a lot of industries in Japan are now facing this challenge. And of course, a lot of people say that one of the ways to solve this challenge is to set economic, let's say, immigration policies in place. However, we haven't seen anything, or we haven't heard anything from the current government and Mr. Kishida about putting such policies in place. If you have any information about, future plans to do that, it would be nice to hear about them.
Thank you, Maya. Yes, we have actually heard certain things coming out of the administration. One of the aspects of economic security is not just hacking, but it's also pilfering from Japanese companies some of their IP and intellectual property. So with regard to immigration, there has been, Japan needs to have highly qualified workers, more than they can produce domestically. So the immigration policy has been somewhat loose, but what they have found is that some of the erosion for technology has occurred, and it's hard to kind of point the finger without being somewhat possibly criticized as being racist about it. But many of the Chinese students who are coming to Japan, going to Japanese higher education and involved in PhD programs, so they have identified that as something of a security threat that they need to deal with. And so over the last couple of months, you've heard about this potential segregation of students for projects that are being worked on at the university level, that certain nationalities will be excluded from that. And I think that is that's one of the first signs that this is going to be building in what you might say is weight in terms of immigration. It's not just the students, it's not just them studying, but it also goes further than that. It goes to people coming in to set up business. If you follow what's going on in Okinawa, there's a lot of Chinese money in Okinawa. People take their money from China and they buy businesses or they buy property, so that they have a kind of out, and they need to have a way to use the money that they've been able to generate in China. But also with regard to certain IP and certain sectors, the Japanese have also said, in terms of, for example, purchasing land around areas that are deemed to be sensitive or core industries of the Japanese economy, people who are purchasing land or houses or living near there will also undergo scrutiny. And I think that you're going to see more and more of that, and definitely it will have an impact on immigration policies. So one of the ideas is to secure our ability to excel in those areas that we've decided to excel in without any kind of encroachment. So there'll be, in fact, with regard to certain intellectual property rights and certain patents, they will have a wrap of protection above and beyond what is normally for patent protection here in this country. So it's pretty broad, and the reason why I think you haven't seen it roll out is because I think if they leak out different parts of it, it could create a backlash. You know, the Chinese are famous for reacting very strongly to things that they perceive to be against their interests. So, for example, I think it was Starbucks or maybe one of the big companies, Japanese companies, on their web page in a global map had Taiwan identified as a different color or as a different economic geopolitical bloc as identified by China. They received a harsh criticism, and in fact, one of them was fined for having suggested that Taiwan is different on a global web page. So there's a lot of the Chinese are aggressively protecting their interests, but also wanting to have the same benefits of regular countries in participating in the Japanese economy too.
Well, it looks like we're going to see a lot of developments this year, at least, and probably they'll come after the elections of the upper house. Who knows, really? But it's certainly going to be something to watch out, isn't it?
No, I think so. You will remember that when the digital agency was launched, it's a big deal. It really hasn't taken a full-bodied approach yet. It is still in the structural process now. It is dealing with certain issues, but it is really deep and it's really broad. And similarly with the economic security, it also is deep and broad. So it'll take a little bit of time, maybe 2 or 3 years before it begins to really reach something that's fruitful and something that begins to actually restrict. We will feel it. We will feel restrictions, and we will feel not so much the benefits. The benefits are more at the national level, at the economic security level for the country as a whole. And I think at the consumer level, you're just going to see perhaps restrictive policies rather than the benefits of that, because the whole reason for it to be put in place is as a defensive mechanism.
Stephen.
So just to add on what I think Timothy voiced, so I think there's a couple levels to think about this. First, there's countries that are problematic in terms of intellectual property theft and borderline espionage at Japanese universities and other universities. So I think those problematic countries, what we're probably going to see is that once the Ministry of Education gets some guidelines, is that they will just at the application stage just reject those applications outright. So I think that is one of the bottlenecks that they will use to ensure that students from certain countries don't get into these sensitive programs. But it doesn't mean a broad banning of students. So for example, if you're going to study, let's say, Shinto religion or Japanese history, these will not be problematic areas for programs. We're likely going to see universities start to develop partnerships with particular universities. So for example, let's say Tokyo University and Stanford University, or other tech leaders in the United States or Germany or Canada or wherever. So there's a lot of ways to do this that will create, contribute to economic security and will keep students coming to Japan, but of course try to avoid the challenges associated with intellectual property rights and borderline espionage with students from other countries. So I think this is not that difficult. The challenge is that how will MEX, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Science, manage this? Second, and I think it's important for us to be thinking about what is the key areas that Japan is identifying as economic security. And these are continuing to evolve. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have said semiconductors, but today, semiconductors. AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, these are all critical areas that we'll probably see more and more focus on at universities, building a cadre of Japanese students that can, learn these critical skills, but also ensuring that they have exchange programs with world leaders amongst, like-minded countries. And that's unfortunately the direction that we're going to go in the next, starting yesterday, in fact. And I think that's the kind of direction Japan favors. But again, I think there's going to be a cohort of countries that will work together to ensure their student exchanges, but also protect against some of the challenges associated with certain countries.
Stephen, can you tell us about your talk tomorrow night?
Oh, great. Thanks, Timothy. So tomorrow we're going to look at the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific through Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision and China's Belt Road Initiative, looking at how they are influencing each other, how they're reacting to each other, and how Japan's, I think, proactive free and open Indo-Pacific vision is reshaping the Belt Road Initiative to adopt more transparency, more fiscal sustainability, to be more environmentally friendly. And it really shows that behavior, in tomorrow's discussion, how Japan behaves can create positive influences on what's happening domestically in China. So I'm really excited about the discussion. I hope all of you can join.
Well, with this, I wish you a great day. Thank you very much for joining us once again, and we're looking forward to seeing you again. This was Japan Expert Insights Room on Japanese politics. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and enjoy every day as much as possible. See you!